Hello and welcome from First United Methodist Church in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania.
We are marching in the light of God. We are marching in the light of God. We are marching in the light of God. We are marching in the light of the light of God. We are marching, marching, we are marching, marching, we are marching in the light of the light of God. We are marching, marching, we are marching, marching, we are marching in the light of God.
That music was part of this service this past Sunday when we celebrated the ministry and the outreach done by two United Methodist missionaries, born and raised in the Congo and now serving in Tanzania. Uh, it was a wonderful, wonderful time. It was kind of fun to go through the whole thing. We sang a couple songs in Swahili. Uh, the preacher, the Reverend Mutwali Wamashidi, uh, preached in English. He was reluctant to do that. He's far more conversant in Swahili and in French. And his wife, Kabaka Alphonsine, was also with us. And although she also was reluctant in some ways, she spent some time speaking uh, with people in Sunday school, and her English was right to the point. We don't always have the confidence that we are able to do some of the things that we are able to do. And sometimes the things that we think are failures, and I'm not saying that there's presentations were far from it, um, but sometimes the things that we think we might be failing with turn out to be the means of God's grace reaching out to us and to other people. If you look at the life of Jesus, you could see it in terms that would say that he was an absolute flop, uh, worse than a failure. He got himself killed. And his followers, they all scattered and ran away when that happened. But through what he did, as Christians, we believe that not only those people that ran away from him, those people that actually did the execution, but all the people of earth have found an opportunity for salvation and to redeem the parts of their lives that need to be turned around, and that he does that, that he did that, and that the way it happened was because he failed. So, what exactly do we mean by failure or success? And do we even have any business using words in terms like that? If Jesus accomplished, which he did, the things that God sent him to do, and that involved failure in worldly terms, then what business do we have trying to say when things are succeeding and when they're failing? Really, the question isn't that. The question is, are we being faithful or not? Are we doing what is right? Are we doing what is good? Are we being loving? Are we letting God do the things that God has always wanted to do with us and with everyone, creating a kingdom? I mean, that's not a term we use too much, but use the term kingdom, use the term commonwealth, use the term community, use whatever term it is. But creating an experience of God's love lived out together with people we know and with strangers, with people from next door and people from Tanzania or the Congo or Mongolia, wherever it is. The Apostle Paul wrestled with this stuff too. And throughout this period of Lent, we're looking at some of the things that he had to say about his understanding of what was going on with Jesus. But it also interlocked with his experience, no less than with ours. And one of the things he wrote when he wrote to the Corinthians was this. He said, "Where's the one who is wise? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world didn't know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe." Now, nobody, at least nobody I know, would write those words if they didn't have some kind of experience of failure somewhere in the background. Where do you come up with a phrase like the foolishness of our proclamation if you hadn't sort of heard someone suggest that what you were saying was a bunch of nonsense? Or perhaps that was a voice that was coming up in his own head. What am I doing here, locked up in prison? Is this all just stupidity on my part? What am I doing getting people so angry they're tossing me out of one town and beating me in another? Is that really doing what God would want? Is there something wrong here? Or maybe it's the right thing and I'm going about it the wrong way. Those have to be the sort of questions that Paul would have asked himself. But not all of us have it that badly. You know, I'll get back to the guests last week. I think it's a pretty common feeling among anybody who stands at a microphone or stands in front of people, whether they're speaking a foreign language or their own language, to have some kind of fear of not being understood or of being taken the wrong way or just of sounding absolutely foolish. And that fear is one that keeps a lot of people from public speaking of any kind. And I wouldn't be surprised, excuse me, if it applies to private speech as well. Things happen when you're speaking. You suddenly feel like you have to cough, like that. And the temptation is there to say, okay, I'll edit that out later. But if you're right there, you don't get a redo. And so a lot of people live by the old saying that you may have heard. Um, it's better to be silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and prove it. And I can actually vouch for that one, but I'm not going to talk about my experience here of doing that. Uh, I'm going to talk a little bit about Paul's experience of it. In Acts chapter 17, one of Paul's companions and one of his co workers, um, you could even call him his biographer in some ways, Luke, tells us a story that um, may or may not have led Paul to speak of the foolishness of his proclamation, but one that may have left him feeling like a fool. And yet, it was one that, in some ways, ended up moving forward the kingdom of God despite him, despite his efforts. I won't retell the entire story, but the outline is this. Paul found himself in Athens with a couple of days on his hands. Now, Athens was at that time the center of classical learning. It was the home of philosophers. These were long before, but still, it was the place where Socrates had lived and had taught Plato. It's the place where Plato had lived and taught Aristotle before Aristotle went off to become tutor to Alexander the Great when he was just little Alex learning his alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilons. It was the center of learning. And Paul, being Paul, and having time on his hands, headed off to the spot in Athens where all the philosophers and intellectuals and pundits and talking heads of their days gathered. I mean, it's like, what's the point of being in Cambridge without going to Harvard Yard, right? Or, yes, okay. What's the point of being in San Jose without doing a tour of Silicon Valley? According to Luke, when Paul arrived at a certain spot, the Areopagus, which means the hill of Ares, the war god's hill, which was the site of the academy, he found something that may have been sort of like a faculty meeting in session, or maybe it was a debating society. There were both Epicurean and Stoic philosophers present, Luke tells us. So my money would be on it having been more like a debating society than a faculty meeting. But at any rate, they were open to hearing what this stranger who had suddenly walked in had to say to them. It might have been a little bit of an amusement, a break in their usual disputes. And if you've ever hung around with a group with two deeply entrenched different philosophies, sometimes you need somebody from outside to get everybody out of the rut, because you know what one person is going to say and you know how the other person is going to react and reply. Anyway, Paul shows up here, and first thing he does when he speaks is he flatters them. He notes the reputation of the Athenians as an especially pious group, and he went on to speak about God, which is what he was there to do, and to do it in terms that would be familiar to them and that would prove that he himself had his own knowledge of the Greek classics, that he had some sort of formal training behind him. He reminds them that the ultimate God is the one, and he says here, in whom we live and move and have our being. And that itself is a quote from a poem now lost by Epimenides of Crete. And then he goes on to describe the relationship of humanity and God in terms that the Stoics among them would specifically have known well. He says, "For we also are his offspring." And that was a quote that came from the Phenomena of Aratus. No doubt, when we read the book of Acts, we all catch those allusions, right? Paul was trying to prove to the Athenians that he knew the texts that they respected. In Athens, the Greeks would look down on the, as they saw it, inferior tales that were told by the outlanders from all over the place, including, of course, the Jews. And as for Christ and his resurrection, they seem, when they heard Paul, to have taken the term resurrection. In Greek, the word is anastasis, as a proper name. In our language, anastasis, hey Anastasia, is the name Anastasia. So after they listened to him for a while, they took that he was just one more suspect crackpot from the eastern provinces. Think, if you will, about how people react to, say, the Hare Krishnas or the Moonies. Well, Paul needed to get over that kind of obstacle right there in Athens, where some said, and I quote here from Luke, some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." It was very different from when Paul was among Jews in the synagogues, where he could appeal to the scriptures of the Old Testament. There he could and did talk about Abraham and Jacob and Esau and David. There he could go on to talk about the ministry of Jesus, growing out of that history, growing from that people's awareness of God, and the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection in relationship to that deep, deep, loving, and ancient relationship between God and the people of Israel. But in Athens, he didn't have that. And it wasn't, interestingly enough, the same in places like Ephesus. He couldn't do the same thing there. But in Ephesus, he did things differently. He didn't go and try to immediately impress people. He looked at the things around and he spoke more from his heart. And yeah, it got him into some real trouble. He looked at the idol in the temple of Aphrodite and said basically, "Really? You people are worshiping this? Is this silver idol what matters to you? Do you think this Aphrodite is where real love comes from?" Now, yeah, it set off it set off a riot when he said that. The silversmiths were really mad because they were selling a lot of little tiny Aphrodite idols that copied the big one. Um, but his words got through. They made a difference, and some people realized that he had said something that was very true and worth hearing, and worth beyond hearing, taking to heart. It wasn't that way in Athens. In Athens, Paul met with indifference. He attempted to engage the philosophers by becoming one of them, and he failed. And so when he later wrote, you knew I'd get back to this, right? Where is the one who was wise? Where's the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world didn't know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. I think he learned from his failure. I think his attempt to be the scribe, to be the debater of the age, to be the wise man, had totally flopped and shown him something that he needed to see, something we all need to hear about and all need to remember. Neither Paul nor the most eloquent preachers nor any of us ever truly share the depth of the gospel when we're busy trying to impress people with our own gifts. What conveys the good news is the far simpler, far more humbling message that when we have been at our low points, when we have failed, not necessarily in our oratory or our speaking, but when we have really, really failed and really, really messed up, when we have been at the lowest points, when we've been in some situation which has caused us to recognize our smallness in the face of the universe and our absolute dependence on God. That last part of it is key. That is when we have been most able to recognize and receive the truth that God comes to us in weakness, in the weakness of a baby born in a stable, in the weakness of that baby who, when grown, was tempted by the devil to just accept power over all the kingdoms of the earth and said, no, 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 no. That's not for me or any of us. It was not accepted by him when it was urged on him by his own followers, let alone when the devil did it. God comes to us not in shows of strength and might, but in somebody who didn't spend his time condemning, but in pardoning. in destroying, but in building up. He didn't come to us in someone who focused on the people who were doing well and who had it all together or projected that. He went to the people who most needed God's help, whether in the form of healing, in the form of forgiveness, always in the form of God's love, helping them to become God's children when they felt cut off. The wisdom of God in the cross is the wisdom of someone falsely accused and executed, who can say to someone on the cross next to him, truly accused and guilty, today you will be with me in paradise, while they were both dying. We do not proclaim human wisdom and human strength as the source of our help, as the source of our life, but we do proclaim the weakness, even the foolishness of Jesus' death as the way to life, both for him and for us. And yes, we don't always, and maybe we never do, get the words absolutely right. We don't often address crowds of people who are hanging on every thought or every turn of phrase. Though if you do get that chance, take it and just be yourself when you do. But always be yourself. That is where the grace of God has found you and me, and it's where the grace of God will find others. When there's a family member who's struggling with depression, you may not have words for it, but you do have a comforting shoulder for them to cry on, and then maybe a word of hope. When there's somebody struggling with grief or loss, we all have ears to listen and a hand to hold out. And we all have the promise of one who walks with us through the valley of the shadow of death, so that we need fear no evil. When there's somebody who doesn't know what to do with their anger or their guilt or their misfortune or, their sense of failure, we may not be able to set all things right. Things do go wrong. Things do fall apart. But we know a Savior who's able to carry the weight and who can work it all out in the long run, whether the long run means here or eternity. There's a kind of wisdom that is not gained solely by study. Study helps, and it helps us make sense out of things. But faith comes first. No particular knowledge exceeds what it is to know Jesus. No special words will be ever more eloquent than simply pointing to him? You know, there's that old song that says, if you can't pray like Peter, if you can't preach like Paul, just tell the love of Jesus and say he died for all. And then if we are all one way or another fools, and, probably you can say that everybody's been a fool at some point. If you have to be a fool, it's best to be a fool for Christ. If nothing else, he knows how to laugh with us and not at us. And if anybody does laugh at us, well, maybe the joke's on them. But that's all up to God. Amen.